And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Hisham Hellyer. Dr. Hellyer is a visiting fellow at the centre here, and he's also a scholar of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And he's a senior associate fellow in international security studies at the Royal United Services Institute, and has also worked as a fellow in Middle East policy and at the Brookings Institution in Washington, as well as as a research associate at Harvard University. Dr. Hellyer has published widely on questions of religion and politics in Europe and internationally, as well as international studies of the Middle East. He's the author of several books, including Muslims of Europe, the quote unquote other Europeans, which was published in 2010 with Edinburgh University Press, and more recently, A Revolution Undone, Egypt's Road Beyond Revolt, which was published in 2016 with Hurst and Oxford University Press. So he's really a prominent scholar and analyst and commentator, and we're delighted to have him here to open this symposium with a talk on the Muslim European presence, current and future challenges. And there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. So Hisham, thanks very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you here today and to listen to your presentation. I may not be able to be around for the entirety of the discussions, alas, as I have some previous commitments that I have to attend to, but I will be looking through the research later on. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the latest and most invigorating research agendas have to offer in this field. And I hope that next time we'll all be able to be in Cambridge together to discuss these issues. I'm very honored to be asked to give the keynote for this symposium. It was a symposium not too dissimilar to this, where I gave my own first academic talk on Islam in Europe almost 20 years ago, hosted on the grounds of Warwick University's business school. So I think they just had the nicest rooms. I was doing my PhD at Warwick at the time with the late, great Professor Muhammad Anwar, who was at the time one of the great pioneers of studies on Muslims in the UK and Europe. Professor Anwar, may God rest his soul, passed away last year after a long illness. He was a truly scholarly gentleman whom I remain indebted to. The other noted expert on Muslims of the UK at the time was Professor Tariq Madood, who I'm now pleased to have as a colleague via a consortium we co-steer with two other colleagues called Greece. Many of you in this room will undoubtedly become colleagues with those much more senior than yourselves in academia as time goes on, and you'll no doubt benefit greatly from that. But when I started off looking at Muslim European communities as a PhD student 20 years ago, I have to tell you, there weren't that many people who were that interested in the subject, at least in comparison to today. It made my literature review a lot simpler, I have to tell you. I wrote my PhD actually on Muslim European communities, and it became the book that Paul mentioned, Muslims of Europe, the Other Europeans. And at the time, it meant that there were very few other books in competition and really not that many specialists on the topic, to the point that when I received my confidential external review from my publisher following submission of my manuscript, I knew exactly who had written it because there were so few people who could have done it. There was something else that was particular about that time, and that was that my PhD was kind of sandwiched in between two hugely important geopolitical events, and events that had a massive impact on Muslim communities of the UK, in Europe, and in the West. I applied for my PhD in early 2001. When I finally arrived at Warwick later on that year, it was only a couple of weeks after 9/11. I still remember to this day that a senior colleague of mine in the university's administration asked me about 9/11, not in an accusatory kind of way, but one that took me off guard because she felt the need to extol how much she thought it had been terrible. I didn't quite understand why she thought that might be necessary. Was it because she doubted that I, as someone who was the son of an English father, but also of an Arab mother, might not quite agree. I wasn't sure, but 20 years later, I still remember that. When I read my Viva, it was early June 2005. My external examiner was the indomitable James Piscatori, who some of you may have read in Islamic studies more generally. I'm pleased to say we became good friends. And my PhD ceremony was the 11th of July, 2005, 4 days after the 7th of July bombings, 7/7 in London. And those were the two bookmark events of my graduate education. I began my own doctoral research days after the 9/11 attacks, and I finished even fewer days before the 7/7 attacks. Now, I bring all of this up for a very particular reason. I'm not sure why all of you got into academia or why you decided that this particular field of Muslims in Europe is what you wanted to focus on. And I imagine there are lots of different reasons. But as you begin to embark on that academic career in front of you, and indeed any career in front of you following your PhD, and let no one tell you that you have to be an academic or that other careers are somehow not worthwhile. But as you begin that journey, you have to realize this field of study is intriguing, but is also fraught with all kinds of pitfalls. After 20 years since 9/11, 20 years of my graduate education and then my ensuing career, I begin to understand the shape, the contours, the texture of what this field is actually like in real life. I don't enjoy identity politics, personally speaking. And as someone of mixed race, my father is a white Englishman from about an hour and a half south of Cambridge, while my mother is a Cairean of Egyptian, Sudanese, and Moroccan background. I probably took the complete opposite decision of what might have been quite a tempting entry point into the public conversation. And I'm not taking a jab at people who do engage in identity politics, only that I had the luxury, and I recognize as a luxury, of not having to be involved in identity politics because others don't have that option. And for the longest time, frankly, I instinctively recoiled from being involved in identity politics because I saw how so many were trying to attract as much attention as they could to how they might be considered exotic in the public conversation, but not out of any expertise they might have, not out of any research they might have done, but rather why they'd make a good story in and of themselves. And that to me was regrettable because I thought it was important that we care about these communities, these Muslim communities, not simply in, but rather of Europe. And personally at the time, and I'm thinking particularly after 7/7, it felt very self-serving to draw attention to myself, especially when I knew there would probably be a lot of interest in a half-white, half-Arab Muslim whose first name was Hisham and whose last name was Hellyer. And despite rumors to the contrary, I assure you, Hellyer is a family name that dates back at least 9 centuries in the British Isles and isn't, alas, a derivative of Beni Hellyer in the Hijaz. I think that, by the way, is what my wife calls an old dad joke, but it does seem to work in some places. But, I entered that public conversation for the same reason that I entered in academia on these issues pertaining to Muslim Europeans. And I hope that reason is common amongst us all, that we care about those communities, we care about their stories, what's happening to them, what their future might hold, and what their challenges today actually are. And when I began that journey 20 years ago, it was a very different time. Even after 9/11, there was still the sense of possibility of how we might discuss and focus on Islam, and or rather how Islam was indigenous to this part of the world. How Muslim Europeans were not simply in Europe, but rather they were of Europe, that Muslim European history was part of Europe's heritage, and that it was an intrinsic element of what really made us all European. When I began my research, I was looking into those original stories, the works of people like Nabil Matar, historians that could uncover and reveal to us these treasure troves of narratives that have been kept out of the public discussion for so long. Now, I won't say that there was this massively intrigued audience, but there wasn't this incredible hostility either. when we talked about extremism and Islam, the focus was far more on what was happening over there, abroad, the Arab world, Afghanistan, etc. And I'm not arguing at all that that framing was useful. It wasn't, but it did mean we had a separate conversation. That when we talked about Muslim Europeans, it was something about Muslim Europeans and less about tying all those international issues into the mix. When I think back now about how different that was, thinking about how today we talk about foreign fighters being homegrown foreign fighters, and before that, homegrown extremists. None of that was part of the menu of discussion in the early 2000s. That was the discussion that I entered into at the time. It was a very different time. I remember Jörg Haider, the Austrian politician, who said, and I quote, "In Islam, the individual and his free will count for nothing," end quote. That man served in government. And because he served in government, we had diplomatic sanctions against Austria from the rest of the European Union, putting pressure on them to, put that sort of thing back in the bottle. Today Haider would be considered a moderate. And indeed, in comparison to many people that are in far more senior positions than him, comparatively speaking, he is. But then it was still recognized that extreme meant extreme, and particularly when it came from the majority. All of that changed with 7/7. And it's progressively gotten worse over the past 15 years or so, which I'll come back to. I bring that up, that sort of change, because I still think that the original impetus was correct, that I developed an interest in these communities because I cared about what they meant, what their presence meant to me as a European, and yes, as a Muslim, what our future could be like at a time when social experimentation from within really dynamic parts of those communities was really exciting. If you can imagine a Britain, if you can imagine a Europe where the study of Muslim life and Muslim experiences are not about securitization, are not about extremism, are not about counter extremism, that was when I entered into the discussion. And then the securitization of 7/7 and what comes after it, not simply in the UK, but across our continent and further abroad, creeps in. And then in leaps and bounds, it takes over. It started to be more and more difficult to have conversations without discussing extremism or countering extremism. People who were involved in incredible artistic endeavors within those communities found themselves having to justify the worth of these beautiful ascetic undertakings by linking them to a counter-extremism narrative, and so on, and so on. It was exhausting to watch. I can't imagine what it was like to live it. Just a few days ago, a book was released about Muslims in Britain, published by Bloomsbury, and that's a whole narrative playing out right there, where Muslims aren't really human beings with their own intricate stories that need to be understood in the ways that they themselves actually live them. Rather, they're problems. They're problems to be reckoned with. They have various tics and peculiar extremist tendencies, etc. And that's what sells. That's also the world you're now entering, which I'm sure you all know already, because it would have been impossible for you to ignore it. So that too is a change. That's a new challenge for academics and people researching this area, the total securitization of the discussion in ways that are quite totalizing. Totalizing and cross-border. Cross-border in the sense of not in one European country, but across the continent. Cross-border in the sense of not just in Europe, but across the Atlantic, where forces on the right of American politics and media are particularly enthusiastic about portraying Muslims as that perpetual other. Cross-border in the sense of across the Mediterranean and towards the Arab world, where our sense of othering the Muslims has a deep impact on how we engage with Muslim majority countries on our own doorsteps, and where, alas, often we have authoritarians who will take full advantage of that. But there's another change as well, because it's not simply state securitization that we need to be concerned about. It's also societal securitization that has raised its ugly head. And by that, I mean the drift towards the populist right across the continent, across the UK, across the West, frankly, more generally. That's how, indeed, that's the only way how we can understand and explain how Brexit happened, how Donald Trump was elected, how Viktor Orban was put into power in Hungary, how La SET in France is more and more a stick to whack Muslim Frenchmen and French women over the head, and so on. And this is perhaps where we come a little full circle in a very ironic kind of way. Because when I did begin researching Islam in Europe and Muslim European communities, I had a very clear sense of the possibility that Muslim Europeans would be able to contribute something incredibly unique to the European story in the 21st century. That if things worked out well, it wasn't that Muslim Europeans were suddenly going to become a massive demographic presence, rather that they would make a contribution that went far beyond the proportional expectation of their numbers. And in that regard, the story of Europe and the story of Muslim Europeans would be not just one and the same, but impossible to understand one properly without understanding both, at least to some degree. That was a positive message for me when I began researching 20 years ago. It's a much more challenging time now because I continue to think that the stories of Europe are impossible to understand properly without in reference to Muslim European communities, but now for a very different reason. That societal securitization that I mentioned, what we've seen progressively is that the sentiments of the far right, and the far right is nothing if not European, have gone from being marginal, fringe elements far away from the center of politics to being really mainstreamed in a hugely effective fashion. And there is no discussion to be had about the direction of Europe and the West more generally, I would argue, without recognizing really front and center the deleterious effects of that drift to the far right. You know, I'm old enough to remember when Europeans and Westerners more generally, in the aftermath of the Cold War in the 90s, felt that, like Fukuyama said, the end of history has arrived. We've cracked. Liberal democracy is where it's at. It addresses everything. We have nothing to be worried about. We're just going to manage everything from here on in. The blueprint has been produced. It just needs to be mass applied, and we're good to go. In retrospect, I reckon that was quite an arrogant kind of sentiment. We woefully underestimated the changes that we were facing under the surface. We woefully underestimated the theoretical and conceptual problematic issues within liberal political thought, which many political theorists now try to grapple with. We woefully underestimated how deeply the problems really were in our communities, our societies, our countries. And I reckon that because of all of that, we became tremendously complacent and thought we could do without genuinely inspirational leadership. It could take us through rocky times. And frankly, I'm not sure we've really learned that lesson yet. At least I'm not seeing many real leaders at the moment. And in that kind of political environment, when you have these loud, simplistic, far-right forces at work, they can get a lot of play unless leaders become leaders and show leadership. Political leaders, media leaders, cultural leaders, if they don't show leadership, then populism will always win the day. And so far, that is indeed the drift that we've been seeing. And this is where I think the Muslim European presence and experience in Europe becomes a bellwether, like a canary in the coal mine. Where you see the far right take up the most power, it's where it hates on the Muslims the most. And where you see the most leadership being expressed, it's where that leadership insists on treating Muslim European communities as part and parcel of our societies and our continent. That's just the reality of how our societies are presently constituted. You see, anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia, they're not incidental parts of right-wing populism. Rather, they are intrinsic. They are deeply endemic to it. It's in the DNA of those movements, and it's something that cuts across this entire continent from east to west, from north to south. The hatred of Muslim Europeans, the rejection of them being European, the rejection of Islam being an indigenous religion of this continent, which it has been since the 7th century, all of that is fundamental and inherent to that kind of identitarian right-wing vision. And this is where the irony comes, because I truly think it will be impossible for Europe to heal itself from these incredibly destructive populist forces without Muslims. When I started out, as I said, I thought there was an optional contribution to be made by Muslim European communities, sort of like an exquisite olive oil on a wonderful salad bowl of Europeanness. Today, I'd use a different analogy. I think that as Europeans, we're being poisoned. And the poison is that hatred, that deeply bigoted far-right tendency, which is being mainstreamed throughout our societies. And in perhaps a roundabout kind of way, any cure that we manage to derive in order to save ourselves from that poison is necessarily going to have a Muslim ingredient. And that we cannot get past this moment in our history where the far right is threatening to destroy the fabrics of our societies, both here and elsewhere in the West, without confronting once and for all this othering of the Muslim in our midst, of rejecting the validity and legitimacy of the Muslim European experience. And that makes all of your work so incredibly important. Because your work isn't really simply about Muslims. It's about this continent. It's about the West. These Muslim, European, and Western communities, they're not going anywhere. And as we figure out what that means and how we all manage to live together, but more how to thrive together, the more we really thrive, the more we will allow space for those communities to be who and what they are as Europeans. And the more we give over to the mainstreaming of that vicious, hateful rhetoric that insists on turning Muslims into alien interlopers, the more our continent and our societies will self-destruct all around us, because it's all one big package. So it really is a fascinating time. On the one hand, and I think it's important to say this and to say it with, some bluntness, we have enemies. We as people, as human beings who want to live in societies where we all enjoy fundamental freedoms and rights in Europe as well as elsewhere. The latest example of those enemies, a young man a few days ago ran over 4 members of the same Muslim family in Ontario for no other reason except that they were Muslim. There were 5 people walking out that day. He killed the father, the mother, the grandmother, and the sister of a 9-year-old boy. The 9-year-old boy was the only one who survived. And he killed all of them because they were Muslim. There wasn't anything else that was there. But that kind of thing is inevitable, I think, if we do not take stock of the rampant anti-Muslim bigotry that is being mainstreamed every day. When politicians like Viktor Orban, president of Hungary, describes Muslim refugees as invaders, I expect, and I hope I'm wrong, there will be physical consequences on communities in Hungary and anywhere else where Muslim minorities exist and hear this rhetoric. When media describe no-go areas for whites, blaming baselessly Muslims, as the Mail Online reviewing this new book by Ed Hussein, I expect, and I pray that I'm wrong, there will be hateful bigots who will use that as an excuse to demonize Muslim Britons. It's why when American figures like Donald Trump say things like, I think Islam hates us, and promotes bans on mostly Muslim populations from entering the United States, I can only see more hate developing from despicable discourse to violence on defenseless citizens of the Islamic faith, just as we saw in Ontario, few days ago in Christchurch and elsewhere. We can talk about how in France, the weaponization of laïcité has been directed at Muslim French populations. A phrase, by the way, by a former participant of the same symposium, Rim Sarah Alawan, a French scholar. She recognizes that this is about demonizing Muslim communities for simply being visibly Muslim from across the French political spectrum. Emmanuel Macron and some of his key ministers have claimed that Islamo-leftism threatens to corrupt French society, and especially universities. The higher education minister, Vidal, he accused scholars of advancing radical and activist ideas, alleging that scholars of race and gender look at everything through the prism of their will to divide, to fracture, to pinpoint the enemy. You see, it's about Muslims, but it isn't really just about Muslims. It's about who we, as Europeans, are going to be all about. That's the reality in front of you, in front of all of you. Your research isn't simply about Muslims, it's about the future of what it means to be all these things: British, French, German, European. That's the real ball game in 2021. And when I think about that, I realize that as difficult as this field is, and by the way, I know difficult fields. I do Arab politics. But as difficult as this field is, it's so incredibly vital and important. Because if we get this right, then we're looking at one future for all of Europe and all of the West, and frankly, far beyond, because of the impact that the West continues to have far beyond its borders. And not to put any pressure on you guys or anything, but that's really what this is all about. The challenges facing Muslim Europeans, the reality is that those challenges are all about what it means to be really European in the 21st century. And there will be no way to be truly European and frankly, truly human if we don't figure out how to recognize as European our own Muslim presence. That's the world you're entering. But it's not a world to be fearful of. On the contrary, because there are so many allies out there who recognize that the future doesn't belong to exclusivity, to narrow-mindedness, to exclusion, to othering. And indeed, that mainstreaming of far-right populism, frankly, it increasingly looks like the panicky death pangs of forces that know the future just doesn't look like them anymore. And it bothers them. It annoys them. It scares them. And at some point along the way, we're all going to have to come up with a way for them to recognize also that a future for all of us also includes a future for all of them. And that's a future that you will partially be responsible for building. It's a great responsibility. It's a heavy responsibility, I grant you, but it's also a great opportunity. These are moments in history that you're living. And it doesn't need to be huge numbers of people that help along the way. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." But you're not alone. You join a long line of people in our recent history that stood with their heads high in media, in academia, and the numbers are growing. They're not shrinking. That's the world that you're joining. That's the field that you're entering. It is a difficult time, but it's a great opportunity. And the need for it has never been greater. And I'm sure that you will all fulfill that potential. With that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.